Welcome to the Jesus Movement Live tonight. It's great to be here. We are continuing on with our series called A Journey to Faith, in which we follow the genealogy of Jesus from the time of Abraham right through to the time of Jesus. This is lesson number 76, and tonight's lesson is called The Persian Empire Continues to Unravel. So we're in that period of time in which the Persian Empire has control over the Jewish people in the Jewish state by the Mediterranean. So before we start tonight, as usual, we'll just put up a couple of charts to provide some background. And so, as I said, we're following the genealogy of Jesus, which you find in the book of Matthew, chapter 1, verses 1 to 17. But at this point in time, we're looking from verses 12 to 17 because we're looking at the period of time after the exile to Babylon. At this point in time, we've been following through the descendants, and we are down to Azor tonight. And so Azor, we start to see that we're getting closer and closer to the time when Jesus will come. And so we are looking at Azor, who was born during the rule of the Persian Empire under King Darius II. So that brings us to our next chart. And here we have, in this colour over here, Azor. We've got this purpley colour here, and we see if we come over to the Persian Empire, when we match these two colours, you'll see that we have only one change of ruler from King Darius II through to Artaxerxes II. The other thing that's happening is we're getting closer and closer in time to the end of the Persian Empire, which finishes in 330 BC. And so tonight's dates, we're looking at the early 400s into the mid 300s, so we're not very far away. The other thing which we have for Azor is some very intelligent gentlemen have actually dated from historical records when he actually died. So he's the only one in this period of time where there's actually a definite date put on his death. Now, we've estimated by the number of descendants and the number of years and the genealogy that each of the descendants would live for 59 years each on average. Whereas Azor, who we're looking at tonight, his life, because it was dated, he only lives for 36 years. So he's a particular descendant whose life is not as long. And so again, we're going to be talking about during the period of Darius II and Artaxerxes II. As we have a look at each week, this is what remains of the Israelites. All the former kingdom that occupied all of this area is gone, and it's now called the Province of Judea, or Yehud Medinata. And as we mentioned, Yehud is the Persian word for Jews, because they're now called Jews, because it's the people of Judah who returned from exile, and it's beside the Mediterranean, and so it's called Medinata, and that's where the term Yehud Medinata comes. Tonight we see the first shift in the Persian Empire. So the map that we've been putting up every week, which goes all the way from Thracia over in Greece, all the way through Asia Minor, or today's Turkey, including Egypt, all the way over to these countries, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. We've got Pakistan and India just over here. It's a huge area, but we find tonight, where we've put these stripes here, that Egypt is finally going to gain control over their own country, and the Persians are unable to take it back. And so we start to see more and more conflict happening against the Persians, and of course this fulfills the prophecy which we're going to have a look at. In this picture, we have a picture of the tomb of King Darius II, so it's a real thing. You can go there today. It's in Iran. It's in a place which is close by to Persepolis, and it's where many of the different kings of the Persian Empire are actually buried. Okay, so from the scripture in Matthew chapter 1 verse 13, it simply says Eliakim, the father of Azor. That's the biblical record for Azor. Now he's born in the province of Judea in the 15th year of King Darius II, who we just mentioned. And he, of course, is the great king, or what was known as the Shah of Persia, who ruled over the Persian Empire. So he's born, as I said, under the rule of King Darius II, and we find that they're not free people. However, the Jewish people are free to praise and worship the God of Israel, who had restored and protected his people of the covenant. He learnt how King Cyrus the Great had released the people by decree from Babylonian slavery, how King Darius I had protected them by decree from hostile neighbours, and how King Xerxes had protected them by decree from annihilation as a race of people. And that, of course, is the story of Esther and Mordecai in the Bible that we've just covered. So tonight we're looking to bring to life the journey of Azor. Even though he doesn't have a personal story in the Bible, we're going to place him in time and events, and we can understand how the Lord's hand is working at this point in time. So before we go into the historical part of the story tonight, we're going to start by having a look at a couple of the prophecies from the book of Daniel. And so this first prophecy that we're going to have a look at tonight, it was given to Daniel in the year 553 BC, and you're going to find it in chapter 7. So if you go to Daniel chapter 7 in your Bibles, and we're going to read verses 1 to 7, and then we're going to read verses 15 to 25. Now the key points of what his message are up on the board here. So we can see these four images of four great beasts. The first one is lion with wings of an eagle, which represents the Babylonian Empire, which of course has already been and gone in our studies. The second one is the bear with the three ribs in his mouth, and this represents the Persian Empire, who are currently on the decline. The third is the leopard with four heads and four wings, and this represents the Greek Empire, who are starting to nibble away at the Persian Empire. And the fourth one is described as an unknown animal. They don't have an animal to compare it to, and it says that they have large iron teeth and 10 horns, and this represents the Roman Empire. And so we have these key leaders here. We had Nebuchadnezzar, who led the Babylonian Empire when it started. We have Cyrus the Great, who started the Persian Empire. We have Alexander the Great, who starts the Greek Empire. And we have Julius Caesar as a familiar face for the Roman Empire. And so let's have a read of these verses. So again, starting from Daniel chapter 7, verse 1 to 7. And the chapter is titled Daniel's Dream of Four Beasts. So it reads, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying on his bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. Daniel said, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven churning up the great sea. So we look at this picture. We have the churning of the sea. It says, four great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground, so that it stood on 2 feet like a man. And the heart of a man was given to it. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, get up and eat your fill of flesh. And so this was the command when they took over the Babylonian Empire. After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. And verse 7, and that in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. And so this is Daniel's vision, which he's relaying, and he doesn't understand anything about it. Just before I read the second portion of this, I just want to make a comment One of the things that Jesus said in the New Testament, and he said it several times, is that everybody should know the law and the prophets. And so Daniel is one of the prophets. We're not going to read into it now, but Daniel goes on to actually speak of Jesus coming, doesn't he? In fact, Daniel has an encounter with Jesus in one of his visions. Okay? And so why do you think that Jesus said to everyone that you must know the laws and the prophets? That means reading your scripture for you and I, we can all know what they say. Why do you think Jesus made a point of this? Think about whom Jesus is and what he actually said in relation to the law and the prophets. What did he say?
Doesn't he come to fulfill the law?
Right, he said, I didn't come to overcome the law, but I came to fulfill it. That's correct, that's one thing. And the prophets?
All the prophets point towards him.
Right, he came to fulfill prophecy. So Jesus says that you are to know the law and you are to know the prophets. Why? Because if you don't, then you have no evidence that he's the Messiah. So Jesus made it very, very clear that we are to read this sort of scripture and we are to know it, because it's only by knowing what the scripture said that we can know that Jesus is the Messiah. Isn't this the age-old argument between the Jewish people and Christians? We say the Messiah has come, they say he hasn't come. But Jesus says to read and know the scriptures. When Jesus did certain things on his journey, he used to say, I have to do this because I have to fulfill the prophecy. Right? He has to do what was spoken before. Who spoke? Who's the word? God. What does John 1 say?
In the beginning it was the Word.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. Who are we talking about? Jesus. Okay. So we have to understand when we're studying all of this, it's not just a history lesson. We're actually looking at the unfolding plan of God, which was spoken by Jesus himself to Daniel, sometimes through angels, sometimes directly from Jesus. So when Jesus said, know this stuff so that you know who I am, he then made sure that he fulfilled everything that was prophesied, not for his own ego, but in order that we could know that he is the Messiah. Now there's lots of other prophecies, we're not going to go into them all tonight, very specific prophecies which identify who Jesus is. But these two are stepping stones. So in other words, in these prophecies, Daniel gets a vision that takes you about current events into future events, and he also gives us prophecy that talks about Jesus coming, and he also gives us prophecy that talks about Jesus returning at the end of days, not end times. No such thing as end times. End of days. End of days means between when he was resurrected and when he will return. Not a cataclysmic event that wipes out the world that we know. And so when we read these prophecies, you're obeying what Jesus said. When we understand these, we're obeying what Jesus told us to do. So just understand that when we're reading the scriptures. Okay, so going to verse 15 now. Verse 15 through to verse 25 is the interpretation of this dream. So we've mentioned all these graphics, and we've also put on the board the short story, but the scriptures actually explain to us. And so in the interpretation of the dream, in verse 15, in chapter 7, it reads, I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit, and the visions that passed through my mind disturbed me. If you had a vision from the Lord like this, with no explanation, wouldn't you be a bit perturbed or wondering, what is God trying to say to me? And what is my role in all of this? And so he says this. He says, I approached one of those standing there and asked him the true meaning of all this. So who's one of them standing there? Who's he talking about? One of the angels. Because this is a vision. This is not when he's face to face with Jesus. So it reads on. So he told me and gave me the interpretation of these things. The 4 great beasts are 4 kingdoms that will rise from the earth. But the saints of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever, yes, forever and ever. And so who are the saints of the Most High? Us.
God.
People before us and us today. So he's talking about what's about to happen, and he's talking about future. Then, in verse 19, then I wanted to know the true meaning of the 4th beast. Obviously, this one troubled him the most, which was different from all the others and most terrifying, with its iron teeth and bronze claws. The beast that crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever we left. What other vision, I didn't do all of them, what other vision, vision, it came from Nebuchadnezzar. And what was it that had bronze in the statue?
Feet.
Right, it was the statue, remember, that he saw, and it had a gold head, which was the head of Nebuchadnezzar himself for the Babylonian Empire. He had a chest of silver, he had a waist of bronze, and then the legs were iron, and it talked about the toes having clay mixed with them as well. Right? So these are representative of these same things. So we see some of these details. I also want to know about the 10 horns on its head and about the other horn that came up, before which 3 of them fell. The horn that looked more imposing than the others, and that had eyes and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I watched, this horn was waging war against the saints and defeating them until the Ancient of Days came. Who's the Ancient of Days? God the Father came and pronounced judgment in favour of the saints of the Most High, that's us, and the time came when they possessed the kingdom. He gave me this explanation. The 4th beast is a 4th kingdom that will appear on earth. It will be different from all the other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. The 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. After them, another king will arise, different from the earlier ones. He will subdue 3 kings. He will speak against the Most High and oppress his saints and try to change the set times and the laws. The saints will be handed over to him for a times and a half a time. So I've gone past, so I'm going to stop there. So because we're just talking about the kingdoms tonight. Okay? So the 10 kingdoms, it says that there's going to be 10 rulers of the Roman Empire, representing the 10 horns or the 10 claws. So we see that figure come up in repetitive prophecy. So going to the next vision, we're going to go to Daniel chapter 8. And this was given 3 years later in 550 BC. And this is one of the things that we talk about with prophetic words. We have these incredible prophets of the Bible who spoke words which we know have come true, but you don't see them rocking up the church every Sunday telling us it's a prophecy, right? Because they're words of God, which have a purpose for what's going to happen in the lives of people. Okay? So 550 BC, this is chapter 8, and this is Daniel's dream. So let's have a read of this. So we're going to read first from verses 1 to 12. So Daniel 8 verses 1 to 12. It says, in the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision, after the one that had already appeared to me. In my vision I saw myself in the citadel of Susa, in the province of Elam. In the vision I was beside the Euphrates Canal. Now we looked at all this in detail. Susa is the capital of the Persian Empire. Who are we following at the moment? The lives of people during the reign of the Persian Empire. Where was Esther and Mordecai situated? In Susa. Okay. And he says, I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as he charged towards the west and to the north and the south, No animal could stand against him, and none could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased, and he became great. Now, do you remember that the previous prophecy showed a bear that had how many ribs? 3. When you read this, what does it say? I watched the ram as he charged towards the west, the north, and the south. The ribs represent the 3 different directions. Okay, so we see a connection from one prophecy directly explained by the next. It said no animal could stand against him, so the Persians went in these directions and overrun all of these other kingdoms. In verse 5, as I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between his eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. He came toward the 2-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged at him in a great rage. I saw him attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering his 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against him. The goat knocked him to the ground and trampled on him, and none could rescue the ram from his power. The goat became very great, but at the height of his power, his large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came another horn, which started small but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land, which of course is Jerusalem. Okay, so the land of Judea. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on him. The host of the heavens, the starry host, this is the Persians. Why? Because they practiced Zoroastrianism, which means that they followed the stars. They were a bunch of astrologers. Okay? So like modern day star signs, this is what they did. Out of one of them came another horn, which started small but grew, as I said, in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. It grew until it reached the host of heavens. It threw some of the starry hosts down to the ground and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the prince of the host. It took away the daily sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was brought low. What are we talking about there? It set itself up to be as great as the prince of the host. It took away the daily sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was brought low. What's the sanctuary? What's the daily sacrifice? Temple of Jerusalem. So, who's the prince of the host? The Lord. Okay, so it says he'd set himself up to be as great as the prince of the host. So what it talks about is that the Greeks are going to come and they're going to stop the daily sacrifice. This is the abomination of desolation, which we're just about to read. So reading on, because of rebellion, the host of the saints and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, how long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled, the vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, and the surrender of the sanctuary and of the host that will be trampled underfoot? What is the abomination of desolation? What did the Greeks do? We haven't got to this yet, but I have told you before. What will the Greeks do?
Didn't they put their god in the temple?
Right, so they took Zeus Olympus, one of their pantheon of gods, and they placed a statue of him in the temple. So they desecrated the temple and stopped the people from worshipping the God of Israel. So this is a desecration. They stopped the daily sacrifice. They're talking about the sacrifice to the God of Israel. What did they do? They started to sacrifice pigs to the god Zeus and desecrated the temple, which was an abomination to God. It was against God's commandments. And so in so we'll stop there because we're sort of going into the future. So again, we're going to go back to the interpretation, verse 15 to 25. It says, while I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, there before me stood one who looked like a man, and I heard a man's voice from the Eunuch calling, Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision. Who's Gabriel? The archangel Gabriel. And so we know at this point in time he's talking to the angels. Verse 17, as he came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. Son of man, he said to me, understand the vision concerns the time of the end. While he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. Then he touched me and raised me to my feet. He said, I'm going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. The two-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. So the Persian Achaemenid Empire was a composition of the Persians and the Medians who came together. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, who is Alexander the Great. And the large horn between his eyes is the first king. The four horns that replace the one that was broken off represent four kingdoms that will emerge from his nation but will not have the same power. So Alexander the Great is short-lived. He has no children, no heirs, and so four generals will become people who will dispute the rule of the Greek Empire. And so the Greek Empire quickly splits into four separate kingdoms. And it says, but will not have the same power, because they're not a united body. In verse 23 it says, in the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a stern-faced king, a master of intrigue, will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation, will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy the mighty men and the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the Prince of Princes, yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. And so what we're talking about here is that this kingdom will separate into four separate empires. And each of those empires are representatives of the generals who were vying for power when Alexander the Great suddenly dies in his early 30s. Okay? So when we have a look at who these people are, we're not going to show them tonight who is individual rulers, because we'll come to them. However, the one that came after I have got on the board, who I'll mention, and this is this fellow, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And this man is the one under his rule who will cause the desecration of the Temple of Jerusalem, in which the Greek god Zeus will be placed in the temple. He does terrible things to the Jewish people, and he slays many, many of them. And so it talks about him, how he thinks he's superior and he'll cause a lot of suffering. And so this is that man here. They call him in the Bible the stern-faced king. As I mentioned before, have a look at his face. It's pretty stern. It's a statue, but he's certainly not smiling. And this is the nature of who he actually was. Okay, so this is the background for which the story of Azor and the Jewish people is set at this period of time. We're in the period of the Persian Empire. However, the Persian Empire is now starting to be challenged and fragmented, and most of the challenge comes from the Greeks and the Egyptians as well at this point in time. Okay. So I'm just going to put this map up behind me again as I speak, so that you can get a feel for what's going on. So the satrap, who is the governor in Asia Minor. Now Asia Minor, just to re-explain, is this region of Turkey. Right? We know Asia as further to the east. Right? This Asia is still classed as Asia, but it's Asia Minor, because a lot of these countries, which we probably don't call Asian today, were classified as part of Asia historically. Okay? And because the people that occupied this land came this way, they're classed as Asian people. And so they call this Asia Minor during this period of history in this portion of Turkey. In 407 BC, King Darius sent his younger son, who became known, funnily enough, as Cyrus the Younger, to replace him as the governor of Lydia, Phrygia, and Cappadocia, and to command Persia's armies in the region. So on the map behind me, Phrygia, Cappadocia, and Lydia. So this is the son of the emperor. So he's there commanding the army and in this region, and he's the governor of these three different nations here. So he gave Cyrus the Younger enough funds to rebuild Sparta's depleted naval fleet, and as a consequence they went on to break Athens' power. So we've been talking about how the plan of the Persians was to fund one group of Greeks against another group of Greeks, so that instead of them fighting against the Persians, they would actually fight against each other. So this was part of their strategy. And so Athens and Sparta, Sparta lower down and Athens here, these two parts, they were the strong nations. And so the Persians set out to cause a problem between them. And so there was a battle that happened in the Hellespont, which is the Dardanelles, which is this piece of water here, which is where the story of Gallipoli comes from today. And so there was a battle in this strait here between these two, and the strategy of King Darius to support the Spartans to bring an end to the Athenians worked. So in other words, his strategy of handing money and support meant that one body of Greeks came against the other and they stopped. So that of course means one Greek stopped the other Greeks, and then because they're allies with the other Greeks, no one's going to attack the Persians. And so this was the purpose behind it. Now, because King Darius is the ruler at this point in time, we find that in 404 BC that he actually passed away. So his time had come. So by late 405 BC, King Darius II became ill and he died in 404 BC. So on his death, he was succeeded by his eldest son, the crown prince Arsames, who had been governor, ruling over Egypt as their satrap, their governor. And so the king's placing his sons to rule all the different provinces. Arsames went to Pasargadae, to the ceremonial palace, where he was crowned king and took the throne name of Artaxerxes II. So this is the tomb. This is what they used to do, the Persians. So on a cliff face, they would put a scaffold up. They would carve what looks like the front of a building. They've got the Zoroastrian symbols up here for the gods. The tomb's encased in there. No one can approach them. No one can climb in from the ground. I imagine in the day no one would dare to, or they'd probably have soldiers guarding it. But these are still in Iran today. Okay, so these places still exist. And the location is Pasargadae. So we told you that was a ceremonial city, so they had different cities and different places. And so this was the city where the ceremony took place, and he was buried just outside of Persepolis. And so that brings us to the end of one of the two rulers during the life of Azor. Now Cyrus the Younger ended many rebellions. So I'm just going to pop this map up behind me so you can get a closer picture of what's actually happening. So here's Athens and Sparta that we've mentioned. And so the Athenians were set against the Spartans over here. So Cyrus the Young, the history tells us he ended many rebellions in Asia Minor, and he became popular as a ruler, and he decided to make his own claim to the throne on the basis that his elder brother was not legitimate. Why? Because he was born before his father was king. So you may never have heard that before. If you have a son when you're king, that's considered to be your legitimate heir. If you have a son before you're king, they're not entitled to be on the throne. So this is what his claim was. And so we can see what's happening here. Arsames, who was the ruling over Egypt, he went to be crowned, and his other son, who was illegitimate, actually claims the first son is illegitimate and decides that he's going to take the throne next. And so once again, we just see this ongoing conflict. So claiming legitimacy because he was born after his father became king, Cyrus the Younger planned to assassinate his brother. And so the satrap, the governor of Caria, which is this place here, so all these events are playing out over here. The governor of Caria heard of his plan, and he informed the new king. So in other words, he dobbed on him so that he would find out. So much To his chagrin, the mother of the king and Cyrus the Younger intervened, and Cyrus the Younger was pardoned, and he was sent back to govern his satrapy. And his place where he governed from was this place called Sardis. Remember, he was governing here, here, and here. So this was where he was governing from. But of course, he wasn't happy about this, and he was bent on revenge, so he assembled a large army on the pretense that he was preparing an expedition against a tribe called the Pisidians in the Taurus Mountains. So I'm going to keep flipping maps here. The Taurus Mountains are actually located along here. Right? They're in today's Iran, pretty much on the border of Iraq. So he's saying he's mounting an expedition to come this way to here, because he's actually going to come here to try and take over the kingdom. And so he uses this as a ploy to say, I'm only assembling them not to come against you. And so this is how it goes. Okay. So he united his army with a Greek mercenary army known as the 10,000 and left Sardis for Cilicia. So again, pardon all the maps and the history, but he goes from here. This is the route that he actually took to enter across into today's Syria, to head across to Babylon. So this is the Euphrates River, and they're going to charge down the Euphrates River to confront his brother. So joined by 35 Spartan triremes, which are the ships, they reached Cilicia, the coastal mountain passes of the mountains there, and they were overcome, and 700 Spartans joined Cyrus the Younger. So the ships didn't do too well. So he actually went this way because he was trying to avoid being detected. And so instead of going through the whole story, to cut it short, what actually happened was he went across. They had the ships come and meet them here. The ships didn't fare well. The people joined the army here, and then they went across on land. And what they actually did was they were heading to Babylon, because that's where his brother was ruling from. So each of these red spots represent different capitals for the ancient Persians. So he came across from here, crossed through here, and he was going to come down the river to Babylon. But the the battle that happened up here in Cilicia got heard of. In fact, the king was over here at the time with an army, and so they went across just to the north of Babylon here, and they had a battle, and the king overcame his younger brother. And so he met his demise, and as a reward, the king gave the governor who dogged on him, his daughter in marriage, and restored him back in Lydia, and made him commander over the army of Asia Minor. So that was the person who told him. I'm not going to give you all the names because you won't remember them. Then what he did was they returned to Asia Minor, and they attacked the Greek cities who formed this allegiance with Cyrus the Younger, which caused further unrest, and his actions led to a war with Sparta in 399 BC. Okay, so when King Darius died and Asams left Egypt, I'm just going to go, oh sorry, that's not very good. Sorry about that, technical hitch. So when King Darius died and Asams left Egypt, so that was his son to become the newly crowned King Artaxerxes in 404 BC, we find an Egyptian ruler by the name of Pharaoh Amataeus. He ruled here from Sais. He actually decided that they didn't want to be under Persian domination anymore. And so what happened, he took the opportunity and declared himself king of Egypt. And so King Artaxerxes assembled an army in former Phoenicia to send down to Egypt. So this is former Phoenicia over here in this region to the north of Judea. And he had this army assembled to come down to Egypt. But of course the issues that happened with Cyrus the Younger took his attention away. And so what did he do? He went to the north of Babylon and stopped this insurrection from happening. And as a consequence, his army never made it down to Egypt. And so this Pharaoh took over the whole country. And so at this point in time, it's the first Pharaoh that took over the country, but the Persians never get it back again. And so this was a definitive change in the history story. But as I'd like to say, this is part of God's plan that the Persian Empire would meet its demise. Okay. So what happens now is that there's a round of battles that happen, and I'm not going to list them all out, and there's a range of pharaohs that change in Egypt. And so what we find is that in this region over here, there's some battles on land and in these different islands between the Persians and the Greeks. There's these constant skirmishes. And so while all of that is actually going on, the Egyptians are able to maintain sovereignty over their own nation. On the map here, I've got a change of 4 pharaohs. It goes from Emertius to Neferetes, then it goes to Hakor, and then it goes to Nectanebo the first. So all of these pharaohs, they changed rule from one to the other during the life of Azor, who were actually following the Bible. So what it actually meant was, because they're busy down here and the Persians were occupied up here, the people of Judea were never under threat. Nothing actually happened to them during this period of history whatsoever. And so the battles that take place with God's hand on it, we have to understand that he was protecting his people, and yet the prophecies were gradually being fulfilled as these regions were coming under attack. And in fact, in Egypt, they were being lost altogether. So the other place which is mentioned in history, again I'll just fix this map, is these people here that's marked on the map, the Caduceans. They had an issue with them as well. They went over there to fight them. There was a peace treaty that was taken, and it didn't end up being a battle. But this is just yet another nation of people who were coming against the Persians. So what we're seeing is a constant nibbling away at the Persian Empire. Okay. So what we're going to do now, because that's basically the historical stuff that's been going on with the Persians and the Greeks and the Egyptians. So as I said, we've lost Egypt at this point in history. We've got constant conflict with the Greeks over here, and the Caduceans even started to have a go at this point in time. And so it doesn't bear well for the Persians. But we're going to go now to have a look at the piece of history that happened in the Bible during the time of Azor. Okay? And so this was quite a challenge to find, because I was looking for, what does the Bible say about what's happening during the times of each of these people who aren't actually mentioned? And so I'm going to take you to the book of Nehemiah. The scripture's actually on the screen, so you don't have to find it. And this scripture, so here's a nice picture of the Temple of Jerusalem, which I've put up before. In the book of Nehemiah, the first 6 priests of the second Temple of Jerusalem are recorded in succession. It reads, Jeshua was the father of Jehoiakim. Does anyone remember who Jeshua was? We have mentioned Jeshua. Who did no, I'm going to give it away. Does anyone know who Jeshua is? He's the first of the priests who were appointed for the Temple of Jerusalem the second time it was rebuilt. And so Jeshua was the first high priest who arrived with Zerubbabel when they first came. So we've had a lot of talk about his involvement, because he was with Zerubbabel when they rebuilt the Temple of Jerusalem, rebuilt the altar of God, and he was still operating when Nehemiah came, and all of the story with Ezra as well. And so this is Jeshua. But he was the father of Joachim. And so what we find here is that the high priests, like kings, go from father to son, father to son, father to son, or they should do. And so Jeshua was the father of Joachim, Joachim the father of Eliashib, Eliashib the father of Joada, Joada the father of Jonathan, and Jonathan the father of Jaddua. And so this is in Nehemiah chapter 12, verses 10 to 11. And so this is one of the few things in the Bible which gives us some information about what was actually happening at the Temple of Jerusalem during the life of this particular descendant Azor. So when Azor, based on the dating, was aged 28 in 380 BC, Jonathan, and he's also called Johanan in Nehemiah chapter 12, became the high priest of the temple in Jerusalem. This isn't given in the Bible in that form, but it's in the Persian records, would you believe, who the next high priest for the temple of Jerusalem is. And so we read about this in Persian records. It says, when he became priest of the temple in Jerusalem under controversial circumstances. It says, when Joada was succeeded by his son Johanan as high priest, he had another son who was called Jeshua. And he contested his selection and tried to deprive his brother of his office with the support of a Persian official called Bagoas. And so this again is in the Persian record. So he had the support to contest the position of the high priest because he had a mate who was with the Persians. But Johanan became so angry, he struck Jeshua down in the temple and killed him. And so we find that this fifth high priest in this list given in the book of Nehemiah actually killed his brother who tried to challenge him for the high priest position in the temple of Jerusalem. And this all happened because the Persian who came beside him was encouraging him to challenge his brother. So who is this Persian and why did he have such an influence on the high priest? So we find that 7 years later, in 373 BC in the records, that Bagoas was actually a eunuch. So I'm going to go into that in a moment. I'll come back to it once I explain this. So Bagoas is the eunuch, and he avenged the murder of Jeshua, his friend, by making the people of Judea pay a tax of 50 drachmas for each lamb offered at the daily sacrifices. And so what's actually happened is everybody living in Judea who brought their sacrifices in were forced to pay this huge price. This is a lot of money in those days. See, when you went to the temple, you paid 5 shekels at the entrance and you went in. Here we find that for every lamb that was taken in, he imposed a price of 50 drachmas. So what does that mean for the Jewish people? Are they going to not go to the temple because of this price? Because it's something that they're obliged to do for the Lord. And so suddenly we have a financial impact on the people living there because of this Persian eunuch who favoured a different brother for the high priesthood. And so apparently he did this because of what Johanan did when he struck Jeshua down in the temple and killed him. And so there was a consequence that came out of it. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions to see your understanding here. In the Bible, the word eunuch is often expressed under different terms. And some of those terms are officer, official, or chamberlain, and they served as a... What do you think the eunuch served as? Why was he a eunuch? What would a eunuch serve a king for?
To look after his wives.
To look after his wife? Yeah, that's true, because we hear about the eunuchs looking after the women in the harem, for example. What else would a eunuch be put in a position of?
Well, because they're quite strong, aren't they? Wouldn't they be guards?
Well, we heard that eunuchs actually fought on behalf of the Persian king who usurped his brother, right? It was the eunuchs who were actually fighting, so they were guarding the king in that instance, so that's true as well. So the thing that we find is that they served as a bedkeeper, right, for the king as well. And this is because the word eunuch means something. Anyone know what the word eunuch actually means?
Castrated male.
A castrated male. So we look at the dictionary. Nice topic to talk about to finish off tonight. So remember, the Greeks are coming, the Egyptians are gone, and now we're talking about one of the few details that we have during the life of Azor. So we find that it actually means, the dictionary, deprived of mating is its politically correct term. So it describes a person who has been castrated and tasked with guarding the bed of a king in an imperial palace. So who does that make Bagoas and his power? That means he was the person next to the king who came to Jerusalem and was mates with the alternate son and wanted him to be the next high priest. That would have been a big problem, wouldn't it? Because there would have been an influence that he would have imposed in the Temple of Jerusalem. His brother was so angry, who was the correct nominee, if you will, that he actually killed his brother. Sadly, he killed his brother in the temple. But however, he killed him because he probably understood what this would actually mean. So as a person, a eunuch, as a person, they would have no heirs and no inheritance. And they would be exposed to the confidence of the king, and so they usually became trusted advisors and officials in the king's court. Okay, so this is the significance. And so Bagoas was such a man. He was castrated at a young age, and he first served as a eunuch before becoming the vizier, which means the chief minister of the Persian Empire, tasked with the administration of the provinces. And so that's why he was in the province of Judea. And so we see all these connecting dots. So this particular Persian official, when he forced his way unlawfully into the temple, he forced his way into the temple when all of this happened, and claimed that he was purer than the murdering high priest Johanan. And so why would a eunuch claim himself in the temple of God as being purer than the high priest?
Because he murdered his brother.
Number one, he murdered him. But there's another reason as well. And the reason is because he's a eunuch. He actually can't have children, which means that he can't lay with a woman. And so high priests, as we find when we read the Bible and the story of Caiaphas from the time of Jesus, the high priests had wives. Okay? So it's not like the priesthood of the Catholic Church today who say, oh, we don't have wives. They had wives. And so we find that he makes a claim that because he can't have children and he can't lay with a woman, that he is purer than the high priest. And so this stuff all comes out from the history. Okay. And so that's a little insight, because there really is nothing else biblically during the period of time of Azor. We looked at the prophecies from Daniel to have a firm understanding that the Persian Empire is going to be overrun by the Greeks. When we get into the time of the Greek Empire, there's a lot more biblical stuff that we're actually going to learn. It sort of comes to life again. Then, of course, when we enter into the time of the Romans, we have the time of Jesus and the New Testament. And so things gradually will build up again. So Azor, if we sum him up, he lived in a time when there was no domestic political upheaval in the sub-province of Judea under the reign of this new king Artaxerxes. Free to worship the God of Israel, he paid his tribute or taxes to the Persian Empire and gave his tithes and offerings to the Temple of Jerusalem. Unfortunately, now he has to pay 50 drachmas to have his lamb slaughtered by the priesthood because of what happened with Bagoas and Johanan. Azor, remembering, he lives in the town of Bethlehem because they went back to their original inheritance, because Zerubbabel did not make it onto that list of people who were chosen to live in Jerusalem after they returned and finished the city. So we know that he was living in Bethlehem, so this is the jigsaw puzzle of what we know about him. And of course, he's another descendant of Abraham whose journey of faith fulfills God's covenant. And God's covenant says that, what does God's covenant ultimately say?
The line of Judah.
the line of Judah, the Lamb of Judah. Right, we go from the time of Abraham. Abraham's promised an inheritance. The inheritance then transfers through Joshua into each and every descendant. Right, we find that Salmon is actually the first descendant in the land of Judah, or the kingdom of Judah, when it becomes that in the future. But we find that he receives the inheritance. His son, of course, was Boaz, who we know the story of in the Bible, and so on. It goes all the way through until we get to the time of King David, who was actually anointed in Bethlehem and then, of course, went to live in the palace. From the time of King David through all the period of kings, we find that each and every descendant was in the palace. But they still had their inheritance in Bethlehem. And so when they were taken off into Babylonian exile and they returned, where did they return to? They returned to their inheritance, which was in Bethlehem. And this, of course, fulfills one of the prophecies that Jesus will come from Bethlehem. He'll be born there. Okay? And so we see that this particular person, although he's just a name in the genealogy in the Bible, he's somebody that God selected as part of the genealogy of Jesus, not to be a formal term, but because he is a forefather of the Messiah. And so we understand that his life had to be one that would not just survive, but that he would produce an heir in order to keep the line going until the time of the Messiah. Now we talk about that he had to pay tribute and taxes to the Persians, and so this required the people to have some obedience to the Persian Empire. And so if we go to Matthew chapter 22 verse 21, we hear what Jesus has to say when he talks to the Pharisees who challenged him about submitting to the authority of both an earthly ruler and his Father in heaven, that this was the right thing to do. In Matthew 22 verse 21, it simply says, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's," so we're talking about the period of the Roman Empire, "and to God what is God's." And so when we learn all these events throughout history, Jesus is actually saying, you know what, it doesn't matter what happens here on earth. You may be ruled by a body who isn't from your own tribe or your own people, but you are to submit to the governing authority and you are to pay your taxes. And so there's a message in this for us today. And so Azor and each of the descendants, when they lived under the Persians, when they lived under the Babylonians, when they're going to live under the Greeks, and when they're going to live under the Romans, they're obliged to live on this earth, which means they have to respect the governance of their countries. And so this is part of their journey. So the next descendant that we're looking at next week is called Zadok. So you can look that up in the genealogy of Jesus. His name is Zadok, and he's the descendant who's going to experience the arrival of the shaggy goat from the prophecy that we mentioned tonight. Of course, that's Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great is going to overrun the Persian Empire and fulfill the visions of Daniel. What does this mean for the people of Judah? It means the Greeks are coming. And so their time of peace under the rule of the Persians is now being put under threat. And so what this means is that Azor was born and lived during the rule of the Persian Empire. He will not know the Greeks whatsoever, but his son is going to live during the time of the rise of the Greek Empire. And so that's what we're going to move to next week. Okay. All right, well that brings us to a close for tonight. As we mentioned each week, you can watch this lesson back on Facebook, where we're broadcasting at the moment. You can go to our YouTube channel, type in Paul Brunton, the Jesus Movement, and become a subscriber. There's we're on lesson 76, so there's going on 76 lessons available to watch there from the time of Abraham. And of course you can also watch all these videos on our website at thejesusmovement.com.au. And just a reminder that all these references that we speak about, they're all put up on the bottom of the screen, so you're able to follow along and read your Bibles and stop and start the videos as you desire. So thanks very much for joining us. God bless, and we look forward to your company next time.
searching for what would truly satisfy.